Past 10 years, the city of Los Angeles grew vertically, building itself a downtown with a skyline. But to the south of downtown, there has been a horizontal move, the black population of the city spreading to the north, west, and south. Some sections of the area have a flavor of the rural South, where many of the residents migrated from in the 40s and 50s. 20% of Los Angeles today is black. And the core of the black area is known as Watts, a place torn by violence a decade ago. Watts has a look of genteel poverty, unlike eastern slums. A softer, more open look. A surface tranquility that made an outbreak seem unlikely in the mid-60s. But in the heat of August 1965, Watts exploded.
For 5 days, the rioting, burning, looting, and shooting continued. It was the first of a series of major racial upheavals in the northern cities.
I think it caught many people by surprise, the suddenness of the Watts eruption. And it really was evidence of a new kind of aggressiveness.
Never thought that anything like this would happen in the United States, I'll tell you. It sounds kind of like something that happened in a foreign country.
Imperial and Avalon looked like a Vietnam scene. I mean, rocks, bottles, glass, everything was just tore up.
Well, I was very young then, you know, but it was like a fun thing. And I saw a lot of things burning, and I saw a lot of things that I wanted, and I saw a lot of doors open. So I got me a basket and went shopping, like, you know, call it like free shopping, you know.
People were sort of saying, "Ha-ha, you know, I've got mine," and so they were in a mood. And I can recall the gentleman, the older man, who was walking down the street with a box full of shoes and saying to me, "Now all God's children have shoes."
It was awful and it's very frightening. I don't think they should have burned anywhere. I believe that there was a better way to deal with the problems that we had here.
Absolutely inconceivable. Only in time of war, full-scale war, do you see this type of ruination.
This is what grew out of the ashes of Watts, weeds, on lots that once held buildings. We returned to Watts because the riots were an historic event. We remember that something big was supposed to come out of it.
What did result were grandiose plans, some that never materialized, some that flickered and died. Watts, you could say, was one of the early battlegrounds in the war on poverty. And these are the people who have been the beneficiaries, the victims, and the managers of events that occurred after the riots. For the next hour, we will get the views of the community. Those who live and work here, who feel trapped here, who feel at home here, and those who feel a commitment and allegiance to a country called Watts.
Dawn in the heart of Watts. 4 housing projects, 30,000 people, almost all black. Just as Haiti, just as Africa. Full of kids, 2/3 of the people under 18. A whole lot of trouble and hardship ahead of them, but at dawn, no problems. Marquette Fry, a terrible past, not a promising future. Reuben Vaughn, skill and persistence, a bright future far from Watts. Ruby Hayes, making do with work and welfare, tears for a dead husband, fears for her children.
Gracious Father, we thank Thee for the food that we're about to receive in our body for Christ our King. God knows God.
Shonda Woodard, hell-bent on education, a profession, and farewell to less ambitious friends. Marquette Fry, who 10 years ago became famous at the outset of the riots, now lives in obscurity and despair.
I feel a whole lot of times, just what in the hell am I getting up for this morning? Because it's been awfully rough on me, awfully rough.
He is still locked into Watts, living with his parents, working odd jobs, being sick and miserable. The life of Marquette Fry has not improved during the past 10 years, but he is one person. The human condition for the whole of Watts is not particularly rosy either. The Watts we are talking about is an interchangeable term. It is Watts proper, a 2-square-mile corner of Los Angeles. It is the 1965 riot zone outlined by these borders. Or for some people, Watts is a more general term, taking in a large part of south central and southeastern Los Angeles. For our purposes, we are talking mostly about Watts proper, although much of what we will report on applies also to the larger riot curfew zone. That means about 250,000 people, mostly poor and black. Many of them, especially the young ones, know that life can be better, but they lack hope. Life in Watts has been described as a straitjacket, a reservation, and an isolated foreign country.
I think it's considered as a foreign country by a lot of people. I think that the affluent white community looks at it as a foreign country. I think that they've cast it off and have given up on it.
Right now, perhaps, I'm guessing that I would be more frightened to be in Watts in 75 than in 65 because of the underlying frustration that I'm convinced exists there. That it is perhaps even more frustration than was in 65.
In general, I guess one would say that compared to Watts prior to 1965, things are a lot worse.
In this program, what we've tried to find out was, how did we get here from there? From that moment in history before Watts got into the headlines all over the world. Before the army of intellectuals and other problem solvers trekked to Watts to fix everything up. Before bold plans for jobs and training were drawn up. For art and music, for stores and houses, for mental and physical health, and before Marquette Fry became an instant celebrity. August 11, 1965, a hot summer evening and still light. Near the city limits of Los Angeles, 21-year-old Marquette Fry was driving his mother's car. With him was his brother Ronald. They had just celebrated Ronald's return to civilian life from the military. Along the way, they were trailed by a highway patrol motorcycle officer who suspected that Fry's driving was erratic. Turning north onto Avalon Boulevard, Fry still was not aware of the policeman. Near 116th Street, about 100 yards from his mother's home, the officer finally stopped the car. Here is Fry's version of what happened as the city approached the moment of riot.
He asked me could he see my driver's license, and I told him that I lost my driver's license at New Pike at the beach. So he asked me to step out of the car. I stepped out of the car, and he asked me had I been drinking. I told him yes, I had 2 or 3 screwdrivers. He asked me would I be willing to take a sobriety test, which I told him yes. It consisted of this, closing my eyes and bending my neck back as far as I could. And then he had me to, walk the curb, He didn't draw no line. I walked it, and I walked it backwards. And I asked him, I said, hey, is that good enough for you? And everybody started laughing. So my mother came back between apartments, and she walked between Officer Minkus's motorcycle and my car. So she went over to talk to the arresting officer, and he was talking to some other officers, and she tapped him on the back, to get his attention. So one of the officers grabbed her and threw her over the back of my car with a wrist twister behind her. And I started to move, and one of them pushed me back, and one had a shotgun and one had a nightstick. And he told me, he said, if you move, I'll blow your black ass to Imperial Highway. So I started to get off the car again, and the officer hit me right up here. I have a scar there now. And when he hit me, he didn't knock me out. He hit me pretty hard, too. But when he hit me, he dropped his baton. When he dropped his baton, I dropped him.
Marquette Fry's arrest was only an accidental trigger, setting off intense emotions unrealized before. The smoldering resentments, once released, led to the riots.
In the heat of the summer, when the pavements were burning, the soul of the city was ravaged in the night. After the city sun was setting, now no one knows how it started, why the windows were shattered, but deep in the dark, someone set the spark, and then it no longer mattered. Drunk with the memory of the ghetto, drunk with the lure of the looting, with the memory of the uniforms, shoving with the sticks, asking, are you looking for trouble? For shame, wrote the papers. Why the hurry to your hunger? Now the rubble is resting on your broken streets, and you see what your rage has unraveled.
34 people died during the 5 violent days. Almost all of them were blacks, and most of them were killed by police or National Guardsmen. 2 policemen were killed, accidentally shot by other policemen. About $40 million worth of property was destroyed. Many people in Watts see the event not so much as a riot, but as a revolt, a rebellion. Historically, many revolutions occur during periods of rising expectations. In 1965, the hopes of blacks across the nation were rising dramatically. The Civil Rights Act had been passed the year before. The Voting Rights Act was passed that very year. One after the other, legal barriers based on race were taken down, and the federal government pressed for equality and against poverty. In black America, there was growing racial pride, new assertiveness, and new hopes.
In the aftermath, one could see expressions of love and hope, tenderness. You see unity of a community that you'd not seen before. Racial pride. It was another way of not forming, but of feeling a sense of positive identity. Even the most conservative of blacks felt felt a certain sense of pride, even though they might be outraged by the violent acts that they felt that at least now we're recognized, you see.
Watts became an instant national shrine, attracting politicians, writers, federal bureaucrats, foundation representatives, social scientists, and investigators looking into how it all happened. The paperwork coming out of the investigations must have consumed a forest. Watts was a national event, and it produced a library of popular books and official reports. And out of that came the recommendations. They called for gigantic doses of help for the black community, a better life for the people of Watts, better schooling, jobs, health care, better everything. Those recommendations, combined with statements made by politicians, amounted to a set of promises made to Watts. They included sweeping promises for quality education, for example. They included specific promises, such as for a hospital that residents of Watts could get to without spending half a day on buses. During the past 10 years, more than $500 million, that is $500 million, came into the Watts area as special poverty money inspired by the riots. Now, after 10 years, what of those promises, and the money spent, and the poverty programs? For several hundred people who worked on those programs, the effect was obvious. It meant jobs, incomes, training, and a chance to get out of Watts. But for the tens of thousands of poor blacks in South Central Los Angeles, the impact of the programs has been less than dramatic.
Well, like it always usually happen with poor people, the money is set aside, but before it gets down to the people, the money's all gone. Where it goes to, I don't know, but the poor people never get the benefit.
Mrs. Ruby Hayes lives in a 3-bedroom house with 9 of her 14 children.
Do you feel like the poverty programs were intended to help the people of Watts, or do you think they were put here to appease people?
Well, I really think it is, here's some money now, and just, you know, this will cool things down. Because at first it started off wonderful, and then all of a sudden all the programs was gone. There was no money for anything, and by looking back at that, seemed like to me that's what it was. You know, we give you some money and everybody quiet down.
That is a widespread feeling in Watts that poverty funds were meant to pacify people. In a community dependent on grants and subsidies, there is surface stability. Life is geared to the rhythm of governmental policies. In Watts, a shopping complex called the 115 Center is a result of the welfare system. It refers to the 1st and the 15th of the month when welfare checks are received and when food stamps and merchandise are bought. Perhaps the most impressive building in the heart of Watts, built since the riots, is the County Welfare Office. It is a house of files, each folder representing a welfare client. In one housing project in Watts, 80% live below the poverty line. For Ruby Hayes, the monthly budget is about $500, more when she works. Financially, she is not desperate. 2 years ago, Mrs. Hayes' husband was shot and killed by the police. What had happened?
Well, all I can gather is that they stopped my husband on 85th in San Pedro. And one of the witnesses said that my husband was standing on the driver's side with his hands up. And one policeman struck him with a first light, and that was when they put the first bullets in him. He had 2 in his chest and 2 in his back. And it was said that the car that my husband was driving, it fitted a description of somebody had robbed Jack in the Box 10 minutes earlier. They didn't have no license plate number. The car was the same color.
Are you bitter about that?
No, I am not bitter. At the first time, it was quite a shock, and I was bitter. But I know that I had sons, and I know what, you know, I would make a mistake, you know. I had to think of my children. So all this bitterness I had to swallow and think of my kids' future. I remind them, plead with them, tell them to stay away from gangs, you know. And so far they have been wonderful. But it's something that I have to keep reminding them constantly, you know. No guns, you know. Just stay away from the gangs, because I had so many problems, you know, when my husband died. And if they would get involved in something like that, I just don't know how I could pull through another incident.
Reuben Vaughn is training to get out of Watts and make it into big-time athletics. He probably will. He weighs 242 pounds and is a growing teenager. Furthermore, he is one of the most persevering young men around. During his senior year at Jordan High School, 30 colleges admired his abilities in football and track and offered him scholarships. He chose the University of Colorado. He has lived alone for the past 2 years, ever since his father was fired from a job and left the city. Reuben, even then, was strong-willed. He visited his father's former boss and beat him up. Reuben said he was expressing his sense of injustice. On weekends, he works at the airport, finishing off a busy 7-day schedule. He spends about 80 hours a week on his work, classes, and training. So Reuben will probably surmount his handicaps. Education in an area where many graduates barely know how to read, belonging to a school system more segregated than the public schools of Birmingham, Alabama.
Some of the education that people get here, they can pass without learning anything, you know. Just go to class every day and just sit in the class and teach or pass. You're not really caring if you learn anything. 12th graders can get out of high school and not be able to read because, like I said, they can go in class and pass, you know. And it's not like in the South or whatever where you have to learn how to read or you have to know so much math to get out of school. Here it's very different, you know. You can get out without learning how to read, get out without learning no math, you know, because in a way, it's not that the teachers care, it's that a lot of times the students don't care.
Shonda Woodard is another student who is likely to succeed. Ironically, she found advantages to living in Watts. Lower academic levels allow her to stand out, and that means scholarships and recognition.
When I talk to my friends, that's the main thing I stress is, are you going to college? But most of them say no. The people of Watts see poverty all around them, And most of them don't see any way out of it. I know some people that's lived in Jordan Downs ever since they were young, and they're graduating this year. And their mothers have lived there before they were born. So I see those people as the ones that don't really see a way out of here. The majority of the people going to Jordan and living in Jordan Downs don't have fathers in the family. But I've gone this far without a father, mainly because of my mother and how strong she is, and she strictly believes in moral behavior. So I guess maybe that's the reason that we haven't been in any trouble. That if we do something wrong, she believes in, finding out what happened, if it was our fault and we knew not to do it, then she whips us.
This is Shonda's mother, 35 years old, a mother of 8 children, an unquestionable head of household. In a community where there are severe pressures on young people, Mrs. Woodard demands that her children excel, and they do. In ghetto communities, it is usually the mother who is the visible parent, who appears to outsiders to provide most of the financial and moral support for families without fathers. But it is the welfare system itself which helps to break up the family. If the father becomes unemployed, he is almost forced to leave home. Only if he leaves can he be sure that his wife will manage with the county's aid for dependent children. And the chances for a black male to find a job are slim. In Watts, the jobless rate is close to 40%. If you include those who aren't in the labor market because they gave up hopes of ever finding a job, the unemployment rate is well over 50%. In good times, the place is in a recession. In hard times like today, Watts is a disaster zone.
In Watts, the liquor stores are the most visible social centers for people with time on their hands. A collection of hard luck characters with a common denominator: no jobs, no skills, no training, no references, no jobs.
Looking back over the past 10 years, what have been the most frustrating things for you?
The job situation, mostly the job situation, simply because if a person has a job, this gives, a person has to have responsibility to grow up, right? The job situation, if a person can get a job, it'll work out, it'll iron out most of the problems that they have. That's about it. I mean, that simply because if a job will solve more problems than a person realizes. And there's a whole lot of people out there that don't have jobs, and that do have jobs that have found out that, hey, well, this is what's happened, because it gives them responsibility. They got a roof over their head. They have to work to pay their bills. There's a whole lot of things that a job can cure.
You had 2 children. Your son passed away. How did that affect you?
It had a hell of an effect on me. But it was just one of those things.
What happened to your son?
I wouldn't like to discuss that because I get emotional over it.
You've got a daughter.
Yeah.
What's your relationship with her?
She loves her daddy. I know that things I do are going to have a great effect on her. And this 65 thing, I don't think she really understands what it was about. And then sometime again I wonder, just like she's come running in the house before and saying, like police might go 2 or 3 doors down. She'd say, "Daddy, you better look out, the police is down there." And I say, well, they're down the street, somebody probably called them, Well, Daddy, you stay in the house, because I don't want nobody messing with you. So I say, okay, honey, that squashes that.
How many times have you been arrested since the riot?
Oh, wow, I can't answer that. I mean, roughly, I'd say, been arrested about 35 times.
Me, little copper!
Marquette Fry's memory of the police has not faded. The Los Angeles Police Department's recollection of the riots also is vivid. It has learned, for example, that it requires massive, coordinated, and quick action to subdue civil disturbances. Police now believe that officers in 1965 were initially ineffective because they acted independently, unmindful of military tactics. This type of exercise uses trainee police officers as demonstrators. The program was developed after the 1965 uprising, and a police manual specifically points out that a primary duty of the department is riot control. Captain James Harden is the commanding officer of the division that takes in Watts.
If you have a situation as we did in '65 where windows were being broken by a group of people, would be to immediately respond to that with a large number of men and control it through means of arresting law violators and giving dispersal orders and arresting those who failed to disperse if it was an unlawful assembly situation. So that would be the differences between 10 years ago and now, I guess.
An early massive show of force is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Many people feel the police would use enormous military-type firepower in the event of a new riot. Is that a legitimate fear, or is that ghetto paranoia?
I think it's a paranoia if among those individuals that you're talking to, if that's what they think. It's a paranoia. It's the United States of America, and we have to operate under the Constitution. We have to operate lawfully, and to just respond to a group of demonstrators with deadly firepower would not be lawful. And so we wouldn't respond that way.
One hears about beneath the sports arena that there are all kinds of armaments that are stockpiled. And one hears of the kind of overarming of the police in the event of another Watts conflagration. There's no question, but there is the feeling in the black community that if there was another urban revolt, that it would be met with massive kinds of retaliation, and probably with a force that would approach that of extermination.
We don't have, contrary to maybe rumors you've heard, we do not have tanks. We don't have submarines. Our Air Force, the helicopters, again, were added for a purpose of day-to-day patrol and not for anything called riot control.
There's a strong belief in Watts, shared by many, especially the young, that the police are the enemy. Police helicopter patrols add to the suspicions, and nearly painted rooftop identification numbers are viewed as a Big Brother act. The people also are suspicious of each other. It is a frightened community. After the riots, they had hoped for better conditions to prevent crime from breeding, but fear was bred instead. Some adults now place their hopes on iron bars to protect themselves from, in effect, their own children. Just after the riots, many young people put their energies into building and cleaning, into organizations and politics. But that was a brief episode. Now, reckless and violent youth gangs have made a comeback, a sort of return to the pre-riot days. The streets at night are almost deserted in Watts. Plain fright, cold fear play a part in this. Last year, gang members were mixed up in about 2,000 violent incidents. Murders, assaults, rapes, bombings, and such. There is anger, frustration, violence, but no rioting, if that is any consolation.
The heart of Watts is East 103rd Street, and the violence of 1965 nearly tore out the heart. The street used to be the shopping hub and entertainment center, full of life day or night. That was before it became known as Charcoal Alley, a half-mile strip of smoldering ruins. In 1966, President Johnson announced a plan to build a neighborhood center in every ghetto of America. It had implications for Watts. The Watts Neighborhood Center, known as Mafundi, was supposed to be the start of a miracle on 103rd Street, the first major construction on the Strip, a cultural oasis for art, dance, drama, film, education, radio, and television. After a flurry of activity, the dream all but died. And there it stands alongside a regional shopping center that never was built, isolated. The cultural promise began to fade as government agencies reneged on funds. A nursery school financed by the state still carries on at Mafundi. It serves at least two functions, giving welfare children cultural and educational nurturing and providing for a small staff. The executive director of Mafundi gets paid only as consultant to the nursery school. This is the federal monument to culture in Watts today, the interior of the once vibrant Mafundi Community Center. It was conceived in the excitement of the post-riot period. Dissident blacks and conformists, radicals and moderates took their first step toward putting together their own version of Afro-American art and understanding. But after only 7 years, it is taking on a seedy look. Maintenance is at such a low level that this federally owned structure can't comply with building codes. Mafundi is turning into a hollow shell. It is being emptied of promises. Mafundi is an example of uncoordinated management. In the early stages, there was a wrangle among federal agencies over who was to do what for the proposed ghetto centers. In Watts, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, financed the building. Other agencies were supposed to put in the programs, but not much happened. HUD still owns the building, and it's supposed to be operated by a city agency, which has no money for it. That is the Watts experience. Big plans that shrink, giant steps that falter. Large sums were often available to get programs started, but the financial backers, mostly federal agencies and departments, failed to follow through. You could almost put a date on it. 3 years after the riots, politicians became weary of the poverty game. The money was too big, and the payoff was too slow, and sometimes disappointing. In 1965, a small group in Watts called the Westminster Neighborhood Association received a federal grant. The Reverend Morris Samuel was an administrator there.
Yeah, Westminster Neighborhood Association became almost the port of entry for many politicians who were interested in seeing what they could do about the people in Watts. And that little agency that had a budget of $40,000 or more with maybe 10 people working for the agency, all of a sudden found itself in clover with a HEW kind of contract to train young people for jobs, and we had somewhere in that vicinity of $800,000-900,000, and we became, just too rich too quickly, and consequently we could not assume all of that money, and we really couldn't do the job. Over the 3-year period, we had hoped to train at least 1,000 young people. How many we trained? Oh, God, I would say that would, maybe 0 would be a good number.
The Watts Skills Center was set up in 1967. At its peak, it gave job training to 1,500 young people a year. They included delinquents, alcoholics, and addicts. The theory was that their basic problem might have been unemployment. Today, because of cutbacks from the Labor Department, the center has shut down most of its classes. Trainees now number under 200, and the school no longer takes chances on young people in trouble. This place is out in the country, about 40 miles north of Watts. It is property owned by the city of Los Angeles. Several years ago, with government backing, an organization called the Watts Labor Community Action Committee took hundreds of young people out of Watts for job training here. But the funds were cut off in 1972, and another hopeful idea was lost: to take young people out of the ghetto, to house them in the country from Monday through Friday, and to prepare them for jobs. Today, the program is gone, and the dormitories, classrooms, and other facilities are unused. The man who dreamed up the idea is Ted Watkins. Ted Watkins is the impresario of poverty programs in Watts. He has been involved in almost every field: housing, health, job training, transportation, senior citizens, beautification. To get money, he has dealt with federal, state, county, and city governments, private foundations, and labor unions. His organization, the Watts Labor Community Action Committee, also operates small businesses which fit into his job training project. The WLCAC also runs an alfalfa farm and a cattle ranch. His automotive fleet ranges from tractors to buses. Watkins is a former trade union man with an entrepreneurial flair. A major effort operating a chain of supermarkets ended in failure, but he tried.
What we have to do as an organization, we have to begin to bring about the changes in the community for better housing, for better shopping centers, for some of the amenities that people in other affluent communities have, so that our people will have a choice of whether they want to live in Beverly Hills or in Watts. And I think until we do that, we're going to see the money continuing to turn over in this community one time. And that's when somebody gets their check, and when they go to that nearest bank outside of this community to cash it, and when they go to that shopping center that's 10 miles away from this community to spend their money.
Well, what went wrong then? After the riots, there were a lot of promises and a lot of programs and a lot of money.
I think what went wrong was that, number one, everybody was trying to put out a fire and rushed in with gasoline instead of with water or whatever it took to put that fire out, and created conditions that led to where we are today. For instance, in 1966, there were probably more different funded kind of operations in this community than in any other section in the United States. Today, I would say there are less funded operations in this community than there is in any other part of the state. Now, all of that to me was putting a Band-Aid, or actually throwing money in, and when the money was not even designated for anything that was positive, for anything to change the environment in this community. It's one thing to say we have given you some money, now therefore you should be satisfied. I don't think that any other community has ever been satisfied like this. Other communities are satisfied when not only their pockets are filled, they're satisfied when their stomach is filled, when their minds are at ease, and when the economic things around them shows progress.
Watkins can deal with almost any politician. With Sam Yorty when he was mayor, or with the current mayor, Tom Bradley.
Ted, you know, we've been concerned about the thousands of boarded-up houses owned by HUD. We've been given some assurances by HUD that we'll be able to acquire the properties. And we don't want to take the property just for the sake of taking. That's why we wanted your groups to look at them and give us an assessment as to whether or not it's worth our investing, what, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 to rehabilitate them.
Well, I think this is a step in the right direction. I think there's more to it than the houses just being boarded up. Financial institutions just won't loan money in that community unless it's federally guaranteed. And many of our homes are in need of repair, but we can't go and get the money to repair them.
There are several thousand abandoned houses in South Central Los Angeles now owned by the federal government. Houses and apartment buildings abandoned by the owners, then set upon by vandals. The paradox is that the government permitted easy terms for purchasers. With no equity in the houses, it is cheaper for the owner to vanish rather than pay the selling costs. Government failures in housing may be monumental. Down there is a case in point, a middle-income apartment complex called Ujima Village. Ujima is a Swahili word meaning group effort and responsibility. It will be interesting to see how legal responsibility is assessed because this project is under intensive investigation by the Justice Department. There's been a major FBI investigation with witnesses subpoenaed to go before a federal grand jury. Indictments were expected, even predicted. FBI agents took statements from a number of people about the possibility of fraud, bribery, and kickbacks during the planning and construction of Ujima Village. The mortgage money, more than $6 million, was guaranteed by the federal government, by HUD, every penny. When the project failed to meet its monthly payments, HUD took over the mortgage, and now it is stuck for more than $6 million. This was supposed to be a non-profit operation, but the FBI cannot account for almost $2 million in construction costs, which HUD auditors found questionable or unallowable. Unallowable costs included $2,000 to lease a Lincoln Mark III for the contractor. Questionable costs included an entry for almost $250,000 for miscellaneous. The FBI wanted to know why the project was built on marginal land. It wants to know who in Washington applied pressure to approve the project, even though at first it was rejected as economically unfeasible. Why was a commercial shopping center built, but no tenants ever found? And who at HUD approved all this? In short, who made money out of Ujima Village, legally or illegally? Ujima Village grew out of the black capitalism idea of the Nixon administration. A major Nixon contributor helped to finance plans for the housing project, then was involved in the $1 million sale of land to Ujima Village. The same man was involved in selling the government the land next door for $2.3 million. There was supposed to be a big post office facility here. As you can see, it turned out like a lot of other promises made to Watts. Empty.
county's Martin Luther King Hospital is the jewel of the greater Watts area. It opened in 1972. It is a concrete example of a promise kept. Nobody doubts that this modern hospital is needed. The community is very sick. The death rate for adults and babies is high. An infant in Watts is not necessarily born equal. From the outset, the world is hazardous.
A very disturbing aspect of the mortality question, of course, is the death of infants even after the first month of life, when they are at their greatest risk. But we have areas in this section of Los Angeles in which that death rate in the remaining 11 months of the first year of life is equal to or greater than the combined stillborn death rates and the early newborn death rates. And that's really unusual and paradoxical. There are no doubt socioeconomic factors that increase the risk of infants having certain problems in this area. For example, one of the main problems in terms of the cause of death in infants in this area would be infections. And certainly poverty has an environment around it, both in terms of exposure and other factors that would increase the risk of even an infection occurring.
The patients that come to this hospital are an unusually sick group of patients, and of course my experience is based on that most directly. About 98% of the patients that enter our medical wards come through the emergency room, so that we are not our beds are not filled with patients who have been admitted electively for diagnostic workups. Indeed, we do most of that on an ambulatory basis. So these are patients that require acute medical care, often very intensive medical care. They're very ill patients.
There's no question about it. Heightened illness, that's why this hospital is just overwhelmed with people coming here with sometimes non-specific complaints. They just hurt, and they just want to be treated for this, quotes, hurt. But all of these are evidences of tremendous social pressures, social and economic pressures, and at a deeper level of a real loss of identity. And that's the level of that I spoke about earlier, where there seems to be a kind of a spirit of hopelessness, a kind of a lack of vitality, and a kind of dispirited feeling.
Hey, what do you want? Occupation care. Hey, what do you want?
Despite the needs, the budget squeeze is on. A threatened reduction of services prompted protest from doctors and people in the community. But disappointments are nothing new to the people of Watts. Here's a copy of a report to the Commerce Department. It describes the attitudes in Watts toward various programs started since the riots. At first, people accepted them. Then they had doubts. Finally, they became deeply cynical about help from the outside. You heard talk about the Watts ripoff, where good-sounding ideas turned into a pile of junk. Here at this dump, for example, several months ago, a contractor was allowed to use part of a railroad right-of-way to dump some rocks, to crush them into pavement gravel. Well, the contractor has since left. But everybody else is dumping here. The mess is spreading like an oil slick toward a junior high school, toward Compton Avenue, practically leaning against the old train station. And it's said that rats a foot long breed here and invade a newly built housing complex next to the mountain of junk. That is just another illustration of why there is frustration and resentment here, why people feel helplessness and hopelessness. Hope died along with the innocent belief in promises. One of the shocking prospects is that we are accommodating ourselves to a permanent caste system with a certain number of poor unemployables hidden away in some corner like Watts, a permanent alien state isolated from America. So in 10 years we have come from violence and hope to peace and despair, and the suspicion in Watts that poverty funds were spent to pacify the black masses.
By 1968, the urban riots had all but ended, and the focus was on the Vietnam War. In 1969, we were spending as much in 1 week on the war as was spent during the entire 10-year period for Watts. We simply lost interest in issues of poverty and race. Sergeant Shriver, the former Poverty Agency administrator, says that in the late 60s he handed President Johnson a $42 billion 5-year anti-poverty program. And he never heard anything about it again. The funds began to dwindle instead. After the war, under the Republicans, there was no rekindling of domestic programs. In fact, poverty money is distributed in cities so that affluent communities can share in it as well as the poor ones. Organizations in Watts must scramble harder for smaller amounts. The people of Watts say that the poverty programs were designed to fail. If that means that there were no long-term commitments, the programs indeed were destined to fail. If this had been a story of Watts alone, it would have been sad enough. But much of what was said about Watts can be said of other major cities, with large sections where people live in isolation, emptiness, despair, fear, and darkness.
NBC News produced this program and is responsible for its content.